Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I wanted to talk about something that I find interesting, and it was a hypothetical Brittany and I were discussing the other day. We were talking about the fact of how anabolics and drugs and things in general have changed the training world and the fitness world, and one of the things we noted just in discussion was that if anabolics had never been invented, this entire discussion about training for strength versus training for size wouldn't actually exist. Meaning, it doesn't matter what sort of anecdote or metabolites they come up with in studies, almost no one walking the face of the earth would be considered to have a large amount of muscle mass, barring a few genetic freaks who actually sat around training with 20 rep sets and mostly isolation movement. Because they just wouldn't get bigger. And if you guys look at the average person in the gym, the average gym rat, you see these noobs starting out who've even been in the gym a year or two. How many guys do you see who train in that way, mostly fluff and pump, with no concerns for progressive overload at all, who have no training programming, who just seem to come in and just do a bunch of reps, maybe to failure and some forced reps and stuff. With relatively lightweight, high reps, they do machines, cables, few dumbbells, things like that, who do very, very little big barbell work other than maybe bench press, if they even do that. And most of them barely look like they lift. And sometimes if you go to a gym, if you've been there a while, you'll notice that sometimes that guy's been doing that over there for a year, year and a half, 2 years. They don't get any bigger, do they? They don't get any bigger. Conversely, it was understood when you look back historically, and people will say, hey man, how did we get these classic physiques of some of these guys? I go back and look at some of these guys in the 50s and 60s, particularly the guys from the 50s before drugs were in circulation, or when you consider that even in the 50s and 60s, most of the guys who were using stuff used way less than a lot of guys who claim natty today. In other words, the average so-called natty YouTuber probably uses more than they did. Yet you look at the size, muscularity, everything else that they achieved. Anyone look at how a lot of these guys trained? Most of them came from strength sport backgrounds. These guys were strong. In fact, if you go look the early bodybuilders, if you dig around in the circles in the 50s, most of the top bodybuilders, even from that era, trained with the Olympic lifting teams from the US, from Great Britain, things like that. They actually trained with the Olympic strength athletes very frequently. Well, these were the biggest guys on earth. I mean, go back and look at who these people were. They trained. Look at guys like Reg Park, perfect example. They were friends with and trained with the Olympic lifters, because weightlifting was such a small circle back then that anyone who was hardcore, there wasn't a separation. In other words, that's something you would never think of today. You would never see a professional bodybuilder or several professional bodybuilders working out with and hanging out at the gym with the U.S. Olympic lifting team, would you? You wouldn't expect to see that, because these are so divergent circles that it's unheard of, but back then it wasn't. And you know what? These guys all did those lifts too. The staple lifts from the guys all through the 40s and 50s and 60s who were big and had impressive physiques were big, heavy barbell movements. They all trained for strength because they all realized really quickly that a big man was a strong man. There was no separation there. In other words, if you wanted to look like you could bench press 400 pounds, you had to bench press 400 pounds. And that's ironic, because you see bodybuilders today who will say, I don't want to bench press 400 pounds, I just want to look like I can. Well, that usually can't be done without drugs. And that usually can't be done without a lot of drugs. And that has been the deciding factor. That's what's changed, because all those guys back then, they were all strong on the squat, bench, deadlift, snatch, power cleans, overhead presses, push presses, weighted chin-ups, weighted dips. These guys were strong on all of these basic lifts, and they accordingly had complete physiques, didn't they? They had complete physiques because every muscle involved in a big, heavy compound movement is going to grow. Every single muscle involved is going to grow as you get stronger on it. It works. It's time proven. And even when you look at some of the studies that try to show otherwise, they're actually laughable at best. A lot of the studies have been really, really poorly done. None of them actually really take strength training programs and put a person on it for a year versus their pet fluff and pump program, for a year straight and actually see who gets bigger at the end of the year. No, it's let's do this and we're going to run some weird program where we have them hit training maxes through the program and call it a 20 or 30 rep program, but they hit all these maxes, or they just test something in isolation like a leg extension, as if you can draw great data off of someone's leg extension training protocol, isolation movement on a machine. You get all this garbage. And they try to apply it to the real world, that when you get to the real world, the only guys who train in this manner who get big are on drugs. And that includes even the fake natties. Because it's the only way to make it work, and that is the only thing that has changed. Drugs have created an environment to where you see big, strong-looking, monstrously muscular guys who come in and say the weight on the bar doesn't matter. Progressive overload doesn't matter. The pump matters. The squeeze, the burn, the contraction, muscle memory, that's what builds muscle. That's what builds muscle. But they're all on 2 grams a test with growth hormone, DECA, trend, insulin, IGF-1. They're all abusing an entire cocktail of drugs while talking about how the squeeze and the burn and doing 20 rep sets is how they got big. No, it isn't. It's the drugs is how you got big. The drugs are how you got big. Which you always see in the natty world, and this has been completely forgotten because drugs have become the dominant thing, and the people with the most impressive physiques all abuse drugs. They're all usually genetically gifted. Notice I didn't say use drugs, I said abuse drugs. And they're the ones telling people, oh, this is how I got this way. Well, because they look more impressive, people listen. People listen and trends get created, and the reality is that's not going to work for the natty guys. And if you guys don't believe me, a lot of you out there who follow your favorite natty YouTuber, so-called natty YouTuber, and then you train the way that they talk about, and you've been doing it 3 years, 4 years, do you look like they do? Do you look like they do? Well, if the answer is no, because you get diminished returns every year, in 3 years you should have made 90% and maybe 95% of the muscle gains you're going to make for the rest of your life without drugs. You will have done that by the 3-year mark. So after 3 years, you should be looking at least 90% like they do. Even if they've been doing it 7 years, a decade, you should be 90% of where they are. If you're not, then it's very clear that there's something besides their training that is involved in this. Because otherwise you would be most of the way there. But most of the people out there aren't. Now it's a combination of genetics. Genetics is one, and then drugs is the other, because the guys who all look impressive are usually reasonably genetically gifted on top of the drugs. But it's created an environment to where people actually believe this absurdity. They believe this absurdity. And they've been convinced by a dog and pony show that it's real, that it's reality. But it's not. And before the drugs were invented, no one was pulling this off. They weren't able to successfully do so. Without the drugs, people couldn't do this, so therefore they couldn't claim this and make this claim. It was known and observed over the years that the biggest guys out there were brutally strong. And it's because they had to be. And those guys all had this concept that form followed function. In other words, the way to look big and strong was to get big and strong. That the look was an after effect. It was a side effect. It was a product of the strength that they built. That the strength is what built the size. That's where it came from. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with doing a few isolation movements and stuff for a weak point, because you might not build perfectly symmetrical. You might not build in perfect proportion off of just a big, heavy strength training program. So you can shore that up with a little bit of additional work. Not a problem. No one's saying that doesn't work. But that's how they had to do it, because that's the only thing that worked. Up until the point that drugs came into the mix to change that, that was the only thing that worked. The only way to look like you were big and strong was to get big and strong by lifting heavy weight and getting strong for year after year after year. That's the only thing that worked. Now that drugs are out there, this whole other thing has been created, and this concept that you can actually separate the two. And the reality is you can't. You can't. And you see a million natties out there trying and failing. Alright, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.